Hey, it's Leo for Actualized.org. And in this episode, I'm going to be talking about Understanding Absolute Infinity, Part 1. This is going to be a multi-part series exploring the logic of infinity, the structure, we might say, of infinity, the mechanics of how infinity works, and what exactly it is. We're going to require multiple episodes to accomplish this because it's no small topic, and it's difficult to wrap our minds around some of this counterintuitive and very paradoxical stuff. And also, I want to introduce some very juicy and interesting historical context which will come in the latter episodes. This right here is the deepest thing you can possibly understand as a human being. I haven't found anything deeper. This will completely and utterly blow you away. We're going to be looking at the question of what is existence? That's primarily what we're concerned about here. What is existence itself? Not what is the content within existence. That's what I usually talk about, is the content of existence. That's what science usually talks about. That's what everything that you ever see on TV or ever read about in the books or ever think about yourself is mostly concerned about, is the content of existence. But nobody really asks the question, what is existence itself? The substance of existence. The substance of everything. The substance of all the content that we see. And I got news for you. It's not molecules. It's not chemicals. It's not atoms. It's not strings. It's not energy. It's not fields. It's not mathematical equations or numbers. It's not any of those things. All of those are yet more content within existence. None of those actually explain what existence is. In this episode, we're actually going to answer the question. It's not going to be speculative. It's not just going to be mere philosophy. We're actually going to answer this question without beating around the bush. We're not going to evade the question. We're going to leave you with a satisfying answer, at least as far as is humanly possible using our intellect. We're going to go as far as the intellect allows us to go right here. So stick with me. This question of what is existence really belongs in the same category as some other questions. And there's different angles at which we can come at this topic from. So we could ask ourselves, what is existence? Maybe you've pondered that when you were a kid and you were curious about that. That's good. We'll answer that today. Another question along those lines is, what is reality? That's really the same thing. What is being? What is truth with a capital T? What is a distinction? What is awareness? What is consciousness? What is the biggest picture possible for our understanding? What is God? What am I? What is death? All of these questions, they might seem different from each other, but really they're all trying to ask the same thing, and the answer to all of them is the exact same answer. The answer is, I'm not going to withhold it from you, it's absolute infinity. That's it. That's the answer. Now, of course, that probably doesn't do much for you because you don't really understand what absolute infinity is and how we could possibly answer all these questions. So that's why we need to spend some time unpacking this. Now, maybe you're the type of person who thinks that such questions are impossible to answer. And you might think, well, Leo, who are you to stand up here? How arrogant of you to presume that you could possibly answer these sorts of questions. After all, there have been thousands of very intelligent Human beings, since the beginning of human history, tackling these questions and struggling with them and trying to answer them, and they all disagree and there's no consensus, and we know that there are no definite answers that have come about from that. And so therefore, it's very arrogant to assume that you can answer this right now. Well, be careful who you're calling arrogant, because actually I'm coming at this from a very open, inquiring position where I'm not sure whether the answer can or can't be found. I'm interested in the inquiry. Whereas people who take the position that these questions cannot be answered, notice that that actually is the true arrogance. That's not humility, that's arrogance in disguise. Because to say that these things cannot be answered, that's a definitive statement that you're making. So you're saying, I know that these things cannot be answered. And the fact is that you don't know that. Have you tried all the possible ways of finding these answers? Have you even tried a dozen different ways? I bet you that if you honestly look at it, you'll see that you haven't even tried a dozen different ways. So be careful. Don't jump to conclusions about things that we really don't know. Let's start from the very beginning and just assume that we don't know anything, and we're just going to do some inquiring and let's see how far we can get. And hey, let's leave the possibility that we might get lucky and we might stumble onto some amazing answers that we couldn't have even anticipated we would get. So let's get to work. Before we start to philosophize here, I want to read you a quote from a Roman poet and philosopher named Lucretius. And his dates were 95 to 55 BC. So this was before Christ, before Julius Caesar, right about that time. And the reason I want to quote this to you is because he hit the nail right on the head. In a very few short sentences, he describes the nature of all of existence. And here's what he says, quote, "The universe is not bounded in any direction. If it were, it would necessarily have a limit somewhere. But clearly, a thing cannot have a limit unless there is something outside to limit it. In all dimensions alike, on this side or that, upward or downward, through the universe, there is no end." End quote. Now, that unpacks this notion of absolute infinity a little bit more, but still, it's too condensed to really make sense of, although he's exactly right. And as we keep going, you'll start to see why. Now, let's begin our investigation by thinking about this little thought experiment. And the way we're going to think about this is we're going to think the way that God might think about how to create reality. Now, don't be put off by this word God. I'm just kind of using it tongue-in-cheek here for a thought experiment. So imagine that you were God and you were sitting there and you decided to create all of reality. How would you do it? That's an interesting way to think about this problem of existence. And as soon as we start to think about it this way, we immediately start to see that we run into some very fundamental problems. This is what I call the bootstrap problem and the self-reflection problem. What is this? Well, let's just say, in a very naive sense, that God is up there somewhere in the heavens and he wants to create the universe. How would he do that? Well, he would think about it, snap his fingers, something would happen, some sort of magic, and then out pops the whole universe and all of reality. Something like that, right? That's the standard notion of kind of religious creation. But then, of course, we have to ask, how is God doing this? And more importantly, where is God sitting in order to do this? Because we're interested here, our question is about all of existence, so basically all of reality. And all of reality means even larger than just our universe, because we don't know, maybe our universe is just one out of many universes out there. Scientists have put forth all sorts of multiverse theories, so we have to be open to that possibility. So we're not just talking about our universe, we're talking about all of reality here, everything. Now notice that when you talk about all of reality, that presents a very interesting problem for us. because that leaves no space or room for anything to be elsewhere outside of it. So if God created all of reality, then where is God located? Wherever he's located, if he's outside of reality, where that space where he supposedly lives or resides or where he came from, well, that needs to be included in reality too. I mean, that's supposedly real, right? What else would it be? So, see, we run into this problem of self-reflection and bootstrapping. How do you get something from scratch? What is God made out of? What's the substance of God? What rules does he operate under? See? Now, religion usually dismisses this question and says, oh, well, you can't really understand God. He's beyond our understanding. But see, that explains nothing, and so we're just kind of like left without knowing where all of existence came from. Science also runs into this problem, which we'll see as we go on. How could anything come about from scratch? And what would it even mean to explain the origin of all of existence? Because whatever explanation you have or whatever cause you come up with is itself subject to the question of where did that come from and how does it work? So this is a very tricky sort of chicken and egg problem. Now, to understand and to answer this question and this problem, we're going to need to synthesize a lot of different domains of understanding. Different notions need to come together, and it needs to be a pretty big synthesis, of course, as you might expect, because we have the ultimate biggest question that we try to answer. So here are the different categories we're going to talk about. I just want to give you a preview. So we're going to talk about limits and physical laws. We're going to need to think about standards, foundations, and grounding. We're going to need to think about arbiters, who's, different who's that are out there, perspectives and relativity. We're going to need to think about duality, boundaries, contrasts and distinctions, relationships and hierarchies, form and also formlessness, and impossibility, power, and weirdness. All of these notions will come together for us to unravel this puzzle. But before I start talking about all those, let's do a quick thought experiment to get right to the heart of the issue. So what I'd like you to do, and I really want you to actually do this right now, is put on your thinking cap and use your imagination to imagine for me an infinite object. Do that right now, as best you can. I know it's a tall order to fill, but imagine some kind of infinite object. You got it? Right? I hope you got one, okay? Pause it if you need to and think about it and really imagine an infinite object. There's no right and wrong answers here. Just imagine something. Okay, so what did you imagine? Well, if you're probably like me or like most people, then what you imagined is, let's say, for simplicity's sake, a sphere, a very, very large, infinitely sized sphere expanding out into infinity. That's good. That's a start. But what we should notice about that is that you actually didn't imagine an infinite object there. What you imagined, and this is commonly what we do when we think about infinity, is you just imagine something very, very large in one dimension. So here you imagined a sphere, which is not an infinite object, it's a finite object, but you gave it an infinite diameter or radius. And that's a start. But notice that that's only in really, well, you could say it's in 3 dimensions, breadth, width, and height, but that's all just in space. So you gave it infinite spatial dimensions. So we'll call that one dimension of infinity. All right? But that's not what I ask you for. What I ask you for is to actually imagine an infinite object. Now notice that the sphere is finite because it has a certain finitude, it has certain limits. It's a sphere, for example, and it's not a cube. It's got a certain color and not a certain other kind of color. For example, maybe you imagine a transparent sphere, so in that case it has no color at all. Or maybe you imagined a blue sphere or a white sphere, and then that means it's white or it's blue. But then if it's white, it's not yellow. And if it's blue, then it's not green. You see? So therefore, it's finite in its color, and it's finite in its shape, because it's a sphere. When it's a sphere, it's not a cube, And when it's a cube, it's not a pyramid. And when it's a pyramid, it's not something else. So let's take that understanding. And now what I want you to do is imagine for me a sphere in 2 dimensions, an infinite object in 2 dimensions. Let's keep it a sphere. So it's got infinite spaciousness, okay, but now give it a second infinite dimension. Let's say color. So what that would mean, and I want you to actually try to imagine this right now, it's very important, is that this object, this sphere, not only is it infinitely wide, but it's got infinite colors. That means red, yellow, green, blue, and white and black all together, and transparency all together, plus all the infrared and ultraviolet and all the other colors of the electromagnetic spectrum that we've never even seen before with human eyes. Put all of those properties into this sphere so that it has them simultaneously. So it's got infinite color. So do that right now. And notice that what you've got there is you've got 2 dimensions of infinity. Infinity this way and infinity in terms of color. So that's good. But now let's take it up another notch and imagine infinity in 3 dimensions. So what's another dimension of infinity we can imagine? Well, how about smells? Now, be honest, when you were thinking of this sphere or this object, did you imagine that it had some kind of smell? Probably not. You don't usually think of spheres or geometric objects as having smells, but why not? Let's give it a smell. So it could smell like a fish, it could smell like strawberries, it could smell like flowers, etc., etc. You get the idea. But now, to make it infinite, let's give it infinite smells. So all of the smells that you've ever smelled and could possibly smell, that any human being has ever known, and every other creature in the entire world or universe that has ever encountered a smell, put all those smells and stick them on this sphere simultaneously. So do that in your mind, and now you see you have a sphere in 3 dimensions. Now you can probably tell where I'm going with this. Now I'd like you to imagine a truly infinite object, an absolutely infinite object, an object which is infinite in infinite dimensions. Try to imagine that. Well, what might that look like? Give it your best shot. Now notice right there, as you're imagining that, that's as close as you can possibly get to imagining God or absolute infinity. Now again, don't be thrown off by this word God. If you don't like the word God, just substitute it with reality or existence or absolute infinity. These all point to the same thing. But right there, you just imagined it. Except notice that you've run into a problem, didn't you? Because what form did this object take? It couldn't have been a sphere because it also needs to be a cube and a pyramid and every other possible shape. So it needs to have infinite smells, infinite colors, infinite shapes, infinite everything, infinite size, and not just large. So don't confuse infinity with just largeness. That's not infinity. Infinity includes the large and the small all together. Every single property and characteristic possible needs to be in this object. So immediately you notice a problem here, is that your mind literally cannot imagine an infinite object because just by the very fact that you're using your imagination and your thoughts, and thoughts are mental images and also verbal labels inside your mind, those are things. And so whatever image you have of this thing, it isn't it. You see, whatever image you have is not it. Even if you say it's nothing, it's just emptiness, that isn't it either. Because that's some kind of form in your mind. You see? So we run against this very interesting obstacle of how do you actually imagine the infinite? And it kind of makes sense that it would be a problem because, after all, we're trying to imagine every possibility of everything that could ever possibly be and not be all at once using our limited brains and our limited minds. And it doesn't seem to work. And maybe that's not an accident that it doesn't seem to work. Maybe that's how it should be. All right. So now you got a little taste. We'll come back to that. Hold on to that image. Let's dig into some of these different domains that we need to talk about. So first, let's think about limits and physical laws. So notice that our reality is defined by physical laws. That's how science thinks of reality. And also, what we call reality is basically just a set of limits. By limit, we mean that things are limited to being a certain way. They are not any which way they want to be. The planet is a certain way, the stars are a certain way, the sun is a certain way, the Milky Way galaxy is a certain way. All of our universe has certain laws and is a certain very particular way that science is discovering every single year. So if we think about a soap bubble as just a little example, take a soap bubble and you can see that it's a limited object. It has a certain shape, has a certain size, has a certain color, has certain features and properties. Why is that? Well, we think obviously it has to be that way because it's a physical object. So it has a certain number of molecules in there that are making it up. So this soap bubble can't just be infinitely large in diameter because as soon as it gets too large, there's just not going to be enough molecules connecting with each other to make that shape work, and it's just going to burst open, you see? And also, because it's made out of water or whatever chemicals, it's not made out of gold. It's not orange colored. It's a transparent sort of color, right? It's not every possible way it could be. It has to be a very particular way to be the soap bubble that we know it to be. And so forth for all of reality, for our entire universe. But it's easy to understand why the soap bubble is limited because we can appeal to things that are outside of it. So the reason we say the soap bubble is limited is because of physical laws and various other forces that exist outside, the environment that it's in, and yada, yada, yada. But now let's think about reality as a whole. What limits reality as a whole? That's very interesting. That's something science doesn't answer very well, even though people sometimes think that it does. You might say, well, we have these physical constants and laws, like we have the law of gravitation, we have certain electrochemical and magnetic laws, and these basically define and constrain our whole reality. And things like the gravitational constant and all these other physical constants that are very finely tuned, which create our universe and make it the way that it is, that these are what give our universe its limits. But the question, of course, is what enforces these constants, like the gravitational constant? Well, if you ask a scientist, they'll tell you, we don't know, or nothing enforces it. It just is. That's how it is. These constants are how they are. There's nothing more fundamental. But you got to ask, what exactly is a gravitational constant and where does it exist? Is it like sitting outside of reality and somehow constraining it? No, it can't be that way, because as soon as you put something outside of reality, automatically our concept of reality expands to now include that thing that you stuck outside, and so all of a sudden now it's inside. So the question becomes, what limits the gravitational constant, or whatever kind of constant you can imagine, or any kind of force, or any kind of limit whatsoever? What's beyond that limit? And then beyond that limit, and beyond that limit, what enforces each limit higher and higher up the hierarchy? So you see, we start to run into the infinite regress problem. And a scientist will tell you, well, like, you can't ask those questions. We just don't know. We only know what we can see and what we can figure out with our equations. But see, that doesn't explain anything at all. Because to say that the universe is the way it is because of a gravitational constant is really no different than saying that reality is the way it is because of God. Because in both cases, you're just positing some kind of entity, gravity or God or anything else, and you're just saying, it's there. We don't know how it got there or what it's doing there or how it's enforced, but it's there, and it makes everything else be the way that it is. But that didn't explain anything, because we want to know, what is reality as a whole? So, contrary to popular opinion, science and religion both ignore this question, because it's a very tricky question to answer. Many philosophers who are supposed to think about this stuff actually never bother to go this deep in their philosophy and to ponder at this level. They usually satisfy themselves with some kind of answer, which is just some sort of hand-wavy, some kind of excuse. It's not really an answer. Well, one possibility we want to consider is that maybe there is no ultimate limit, and that maybe this infinite regress is not really a problem, but is actually a feature of reality. See, a lot of times, most times, when human beings run into an infinite regress, we say, well, that's clearly a mistake. Can't be like that. But, we're doing this investigation from scratch. We're not making any assumptions about anything here. We can't take anything for granted. So in our investigation, we are going to be accepting maybe uncomfortable truths. And one of these might be that we have our infinite regress, and maybe that's how it should be. And maybe reality has no ultimate limit. So let's just keep that in mind as we move on to cover some of these other notions. So the next notion we want to talk about is standards, foundations, and grounding. So the interesting philosophical question here is, what is the standard by which anything is judged or assessed? This is a very tricky topic, because I'm not talking about your personal judgments of like, oh, that's beautiful, that's ugly, that's good, that's evil, I like that, I hate this, not these kinds of judgments. I mean judgments and assessments of all of reality. How can you assess any of it? By what standard? What standard shall we use to make sense of reality? You see why this is tricky? Because the standard itself, whichever one we would choose, is itself part of reality and part of the problem and could easily be disputed by somebody else. So let's say we wanted to simplistically measure reality with a yardstick, just a yardstick. Well, that yardstick, we would think like, okay, well, we can just walk around the universe and just kind of measure from here to there, and we can maybe measure how many yardsticks there are across the sun, across the whole galaxy, and so forth, and that would be good. And now we're understanding what the universe is. Except notice that really this yardstick is a piece of the problem. It's a piece of reality itself, and it only works relatively speaking. We can't take this yardstick and then now somehow move it outside of reality and now measure reality from outside as though like we wanted to measure the diameter of all of reality. You notice we can't do that, you see, because if the yardstick was able to somehow become outside of reality, reality would automatically expand to now include that yardstick, and wherever that yardstick is outside of reality would have to be included inside of reality. See, very tricky. But not just yardsticks. All methods, all standards that we could use to make any kind of measurements or sense of reality are subject to this problem, because they are all subsets of reality itself. For example, the scientific method, or some kind of religious method, or reasoning, or logic, or any other kind of method or standard that you could imagine is also part of the reality that's trying to be explained here. And that creates a problem, because it's like we're trying to reach outside of reality to grab a hold of reality, but we can't do that because the reaching outside is the reality, you see? And we're trying to do the impossible feat here of explaining the ultimate or the superset using a subset. You see how every single method, whether scientific or religious or anything else, or philosophical, is going to be a subset, a small piece of the entire whole. You see that? It's very important. Keep that in mind as we keep going. Another question we could ask ourselves here, a very fundamental one, is what could ground anything? How can anything be a foundation for anything else? This question of grounding is very important. And a good example, just to illustrate what I mean by grounding, is we could ask the question, what's the grounding for my standing here before you? I'm standing right now on my feet. Well, we could say, okay, so I'm standing on the carpet. So the carpet is the grounding for me. But what's the grounding for the carpet? Well, it's the foundation of the building. And what's the grounding for the foundation of the building? It's the earth. And what's the grounding for the whole earth? Well, we would say it's the vacuum of empty space. But what's the grounding for the vacuum of empty space? That's a little tricky. Now we might say, well, it's the space-time continuum that Einstein described. What's the grounding for that then? And now we just say, well, that's as far as it goes. That is the ultimate ground. Space-time. That's it. But is that really it? That's an interesting question. Another way to think about grounding is we could say, well, we can zoom in. See, if we zoom into you and to your feet and to the earth, we could see that there are molecules in there, and then we break those molecules apart. There's atoms in there. But what's the foundation for the atoms? Well, it's the quarks. And what's the foundation for the quarks? We split those apart, and then it's some smaller subatomic particles. And what's the foundation for those? Well, we go all the way down into the deepest bowels of modern physics, and it's something like string theory. And these are little vibrating strings that make up everything. But then what's the grounding for strings? What are they made out of? What's their substance? And then we say, of course, we don't know. The strings aren't made out of anything. They're just little vibrating strings, or we could even say they're like mathematical equations. So are we now saying that mathematical equations are the grounding for everything? Is that really correct? So here we potentially also run into an infinite regress problem, you see, because we can go lower and lower and lower into our foundations and discover more and more foundations underneath those. And the only thing that seems to limit that is our limited tools and microscopes and telescopes and ability to count to the 100 decimal points. So that just becomes an observation problem for the most part. But we have to also be open to the possibility that, hey, maybe there is no ground for all of reality. Maybe there's an infinite regress, and there's an infinite chain of objects going all the way down, and it never ends. Like those Russian nesting Matryoshka dolls, and they go on forever. There's never a doll at the very end that you reach to where you say, that's the one, the innermost one, the most fundamental one. And there might not also be the outermost one. Now that's a pretty weird notion. We don't like to think of reality as being this set of infinite dolls, because there's actually a very interesting truth that we have to admit in that case. If it truly is infinite like that in both directions or in all directions, then ultimately, what is the substance of everything? It might have to be nothing. Literally so. So just keep that in mind for now. Let's move on and talk about whose, arbiters, perspectives, and relativity. Now, don't be confused by this word whose. I just mean who. Who is like you and me and your dog. These are all whose. And basically what that just denotes is a perspective on life. That's what a who is. We think of the world as being constituted of these various perspectives, don't we? You have a perspective which is different from mine, different from your spouse, different from your dog, different from your kids, different from your coworkers, and so forth. Very obvious. But many people don't really think about the ramifications of this, because that means everyone is looking at reality from their limited perspective. And we acknowledge that every perspective is limited, isn't it? Because, well, that's almost true by definition. That's what a perspective is. It's a viewpoint onto the world, which means it's not the whole world, it's just a viewpoint. And if we're very careful and honest, we have to admit that really all we know of the world is just our viewpoints of the world. We never see the world or the universe or reality in any kind of raw, direct sense. We only see it through our perspectives, don't we? Isn't that true? Check for yourself right now. Now, the very fundamental question that arises here is, if that's the case, who is the arbiter of what is real? Who is the arbiter of objective reality? Whose perspective shall we use as the standard to adjudicate between all the other perspectives that are available? This is a very deep epistemic problem. Because if you say, well, my perspective, of course, my perspective is the right one. Well, how do you know? Well, I just know it's mine. It's right. But then that's just another perspective, if you take that perspective, you see. And if you say, well, okay, what we'll do, Leo, is we'll just take all the most intelligent human beings and we'll gather a consensus of all the scientists, all their perspectives combined together and averaged out through some sort of democratic process, that will yield the ultimate perspective. That's how we'll know which perspective is correct. But what is that but another perspective? And even if you do that, I mean, it's quite obvious that what you're doing is you're taking some sort of average, or you're using some sort of democratic process to adjudicate truth and reality. That just doesn't strike you as correct, right? Because in a democracy, many people are still left out. Many opinions and perspectives are left out. How do you know that you're including the right ones and you're not leaving out the wrong ones? And why would just a majority consensus be the right way? How do we know that's right? Isn't that just another perspective? You might say, well, we have the perspective of science. But what is the perspective of science? That's also a perspective, a partial perspective. You might say, no, Leo, science is the right perspective. We all know that. Right, that's a perspective. No, Leo, it's really right. Yeah, that's another perspective. You see? You can't get out of this problem. You're always stuck in a perspective. And if you take a close look, it's always your perspective. You don't have access to really anybody else's perspective but yours. So even this notion of science's perspective, well, that's a rather conceptual notion. There really is no such notion. There's your perspective, and there's the perspective of a bunch of other scientists, individually speaking, but then these scientists, they don't agree. A lot of scientists disagree about how to view the world and what it really is. So this becomes a big problem. Whose experience set is the ultimate one? How can we claim that there even is an ultimate reality or an objective reality out there when we don't have direct access to it and all our perspectives are ultimately different and they disagree? They don't all agree, not even close. Are we to say that all these perspectives are equally correct? Well, no, we don't want to say that. We would never want to say that. We want to say my perspective is correct, or our perspective is correct, and theirs is wrong. But based on what are you saying that your perspective is correct? Based on your perspective? Can you see the vicious circularity there? The question begging? When you say your perspective is correct or our perspective is the best, that's your perspective. To somebody else, their perspective is different, you see? Now, here's a very interesting thing to think about. What might the ultimate perspective be like? If we're thinking about God, what would God's perspective be? The ultimate perspective, not the limited human perspective. And notice, by the way, that we were just talking about human perspectives, but human perspectives, there's a lot more than going on in the world than just human perspectives. So we might think that, okay, Leo, here's how we can solve this problem. Humanity is advancing and, technology is becoming a big thing now. So we've got the internet. That seems like a potential solution here. If we upload all the world's information to the internet and then somehow we're able to hook our brains directly into the internet, Matrix style, Now we've got access to the whole internet. And that gives me a much wider perspective than ever before. Millions of books injected straight into my brain. And also, if we interconnect all 7 billion people on the planet in this way, we've got this sort of hive mind, this Borg-like organism, this superorganism of minds. And now we've got a much broader perspective. And now we've got God's perspective. Right? Well, not so fast. Because notice, you are still infinitely far away from God's perspective in that case. Why is that so? Because scientists estimate that there are right now on this planet alive 10 quintillion insects. 10 quintillion insects. Those are all individual perspectives. So if we wanted God's perspective truly, we would have to incorporate not only all 7 billion people, but 10 quintillion insects. And not just that, but every single living entity on this planet. And not just that, because that would still leave out a lot of inanimate objects, trees, and, well, trees aren't inanimate, but it would leave out trees, it would leave out grass, it would leave out rocks and mountains and everything. But I mean, we'd need to include that to really get the full God's perspective, wouldn't we? You might say, well, a tree doesn't really have a perspective, so we don't need to include it. But even that, in a sense, is sort of its perspective, that it doesn't have a perspective. So we need to include that too. And we don't really know what a tree's perspective is. Maybe it does have some kind of very rudimentary perspective, very non-human, but still, we need to include that. And any kind of aliens we find out there, we need to include. So not just this planet, not just this solar system, every single star, hundreds of millions of billions of stars, billions of galaxies throughout the entire universe, and that would just be our universe. If there are multiple universes, we need to include everything there as well. Now, if we did all that, now we're getting a little bit closer to God's perspective. You see? So this is really tricky. We're very, very far away from God's perspective, if such a thing is even remotely possible. Now, Albert Einstein, a little over 100 years ago, released the theory of general relativity. And he proved that time, think about this, time itself is relative. Fucking time itself. Really get this right now, because this is very important to this line of reasoning. Of all the things that we know about reality, one of the things that we think of as the most absolute and surest thing that is certainly not relative to other people and other creatures is time itself, right? Surely time is absolute. And yet Albert Einstein proved it was otherwise. Time is relative. And I sometimes hear people complaining when I talk about moral relativism. And they get offended about moral relativism. Leo, moral relativism, how could that be? Fucking time is relative. Physical time and space are relative. That's what our science is demonstrating. And we have a lot of technologies like GPS systems and so forth, and there have been a lot of successful predictions using Einstein's general relativity. It's quite well supported by the empirical evidence. So time is relative. Now, what this opens us up to is an interesting possibility. What if there's no mistake? What if we have all these perspectives and that's what constitutes reality? And that what reality is not some sort of objective physical world out there behind the scenes, but actually it is an absolute relativity. That reality, including physical reality, and everything you've ever known is absolutely relative. It is that way from your perspective. And it's a totally different way from some other perspective. And that there's no mistake about that. That's how it actually is. That's not just how it seems. That's not just an appearance. That's not just a subjective thing. That is reality. Now that presents us with a rather elegant solution to some of these very tricky problems. It might allow us then to bootstrap everything from nothing. See? Because all we need to do is actually create a perspective. And that, in a sense, is creating reality. As we create more perspectives, we create more reality. And without perspectives, we might say there is no reality. Or the reality is that everything is absolutely relative. All right, so I know that's kind of a weird notion to think about, but put that on the back burner and let's move on to the next topic, which is, let's think about duality, boundaries, contrasts, and distinctions. These are very fundamental to how we experience reality. Notice that everything you know and experience is actually a set of opposites, otherwise known as dualities or distinctions. Up versus down, left versus right, north versus south, the top of the earth versus the bottom of the earth, big versus small, black versus white, sharp versus dull, pretty versus ugly, smart versus stupid, rich versus poor, and even existing versus non-existing. Really notice right now in your experience directly that the only way that you know anything or experience anything is by contrast. That's how things are known. That's what things are, in a sense, is they are contrasts from the things which they are not. So if I have a dog, the dog contrasts against the background around which you see him. If there was no contrast between the dog and the background, maybe there wouldn't be a dog and a background. Not just that you couldn't see them. I'm not just talking about color here. I'm talking about contrast in a much more fundamental way. Try to imagine right now a perspective which has zero contrast. What do you get? Notice that you can't even get a perspective going because a perspective is contrasted with no perspective, lack of perspective, or we might say everythingness, right? You don't even have that, let alone any kind of content within that perspective. You can't have any kind of content. There can't be any physical objects or things in that perspective of no contrast, because how would you tell it apart from everything else? It would just be sort of a whiteout or a blackout. But even that isn't quite accurate, because the only sense we can make of whiteout or blackout is because they're opposites. So what would you have if you didn't have any contrasts? Notice that you couldn't even point at an object within this no contrast perspective, because to point at a thing requires that the thing is contrasted from the background, and whatever you're pointing with has to be contrasted from the thing. Because if there's no contrast between the thing and the pointing, it's one. You see? Very interesting. So contrast, we can also call these distinctions. One thing is distinct from another thing in that it's not it. It's different from it. So a cat is distinct from a dog. Why is that? Because the cat is this way and it's not the dog way. If the cat looked and behaved exactly like the dog, you couldn't tell them apart. Now, these distinctions are very interesting things because we tend to hold them as objectively true. But this doesn't pass muster if we look at it even a little bit in depth, because we know that human beings make all sorts of different distinctions. For example, there's the cliche example of how they say that Eskimos have, 10 or 20 different words for different types of snow, because they make that many fine distinctions within snow, Whereas us Westerners who don't live in the North Pole, we only make two distinctions, snow and ice. See? So distinctions are, in a sense, relative. What kind of distinctions you make shapes the kind of world that you see. You see that? It's a lot more significant than you would initially think. A good artist, or a good mechanic, or a good carpenter will make many, many more distinctions about their domain of mastery, like let's say carpentry, than you would. To you, you walk into a carpenter shop, you see a bunch of different type of wood, and you call all of it just wood, because you've never bothered to study wood. But to a carpenter, he makes 20 different types of distinctions of wood, and even the same type of wood, he'll look at it, he'll make all these micro distinctions within that. Like, look at this wood, look at the grain in the wood, look at these holes, look at the knots in the wood, all this sort of stuff. The flexibility, different characteristics of the wood. See? But to an uninformed person, it's just wood. And that person just walks into the shop and sees wood, whereas the carpenter walks into a shop, he sees something different, something more refined. What if distinctions are relative as well? What if all contrasts are relative? After all, how do we arbitrate between different possible distinctions? You make a distinction that way, I make my distinction this way. How do we tell who is right? See? We run into that problem we ran into before about perspectives and arbiters. It's also interesting to think about how the opposites are joined. So notice that you have a bunch of distinctions in your experience, but it's not like these distinctions just live off by themselves. Everything in your experience is a unity. So it's not like there's a cat floating up over there and a dog down there and you're a tree in your house over there and a car over there. No, it's all unified together. So even though we say that black is not white and up is not down, where exactly is the boundary there? See, it's tricky. A good way to look at it is take a coin. Take a coin and look at its two sides. You got the tails and the heads. Now, we say that tails and heads are totally opposite things. And yet, when we look at the coin, look at the edge of the coin, where exactly does tails end and heads begin? Is there any clear demarcation or boundary there? Notice that the sides actually touch. And that technically speaking, heads actually is tails and tails is heads. They can't be separate from each other. You see? Maybe this is not an accident. Maybe there's something deep and fundamental about that. Maybe all these polar opposites and all these dualities have to actually be together because they're all unified in our experience. They don't just float around somewhere. How can anything be separate from anything else? And who says what constitutes a legitimate boundary? So for example, there's the boundary called Leo. You think of the boundary called Leo as being this right here, or this right here, right? That's the boundary. And if I ask you, well, how do you really know that this boundary here is what constitutes Leo? You say, well, look, it's very clear. Like the skin, clearly you're encapsulated by this skin. But if we take that line of reasoning a little bit further, we ask, well, but zoom in on the skin. The skin has all these little pores and it has little hairs. Do these hairs count as Leo too? We would probably say, yeah, these hairs must count as well. Okay, but what about one of these hairs which is like half detached? So when it's half detached, is it still part of Leo? And you would probably say, yeah, it is. Okay, but what about when it's actually detached? It stops being Leo at that very second, and now it's something else? And then what about the pores and the oxygen that's going into my lungs right now? Oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, all these chemicals. So these are now actually going into my lungs. Little tiny pockets in my lungs are holding all these. So is that oxygen a part of Leo? We would probably say, no, it's not. Okay, but what about the oxygen in my cells? Is that a part of Leo? And we would say, well, yeah, that probably should count as part of Leo. But see, when you really get down into it, you start to see that actually this notion of a boundary doesn't actually exist. Maybe boundaries are something we create. Now think about the significance of that. That boundaries are not things that exist in objective reality, but that these are things that we create or we project onto reality. After all, who's to say which boundary constitutes a boundary? It might seem obvious if I bring a chair to you, you would say that's obviously a chair, versus a table, and you say that's obviously a table. Those are two separate boundaries. Those are objective boundaries. But see, if I take a chair and a table and I bring it to someone who lives in the Amazon, to them, they're not going to have that boundary between chair and table. They don't really distinguish these things. To them, it's all the same. And if I bring you two chairs that are very similar looking, you say they're the same type of chair. But then I say, oh no, but they're totally different because look, this chair is this way and that chair is this way. So see, this notion of boundary might be more subjective than you ever thought. Who's to say which contrasts in the world are of any significance? And notice that it's not just a matter of drawing boundaries, it's also a matter of which boundaries do we give significance to? Because there are millions of boundaries in the world that you completely ignore. And honestly, you only care about the ones that somehow affect you in some significant way, that have value to you. All other boundaries you ignore. And science keeps making new boundaries. As we learn stuff, we make more boundaries, more distinctions. So maybe boundaries are actually relative, and maybe significance of these boundaries is also relative. You got to wonder, what is the substance of a distinction or a boundary or a contrast? So you could take a look at your hand right now, look at it, and see whatever background is behind the hand, and just ask yourself, okay, so there's this contrast of the hand and the contrast of the background, but then the fact that these things are contrasting, what is the actual substance of that distinction? Don't fall into the trap of thinking it's something like atoms or molecules. It's not that. Contrasts and distinctions are not made out of molecules. Molecules are themselves a contrast, you see? Notice this is very tricky because any kind of physical object that you might posit as the substance of a distinction is itself a distinction. Ah, very interesting. So what the hell is a distinction then? I'll let you mull that over as I keep talking. And by the way, what about distinctions from God's perspective? Are there any? So from your perspective, you make a bunch of distinctions, and I make my own kind of distinctions, and so does everybody else. What kind of distinctions does God make? Does he make no distinctions? Does he make all possible distinctions? Does he cherry pick which distinctions he makes? Are some distinctions more important to God than other distinctions? What is reality but a collection of distinctions? Can you think of any object or anything that even constitutes reality which is not a contrast to something else, and therefore a distinction? So maybe what reality is just distinctions. Interesting. What then would reality be to God? Because God's perspective would have to include everything, we would think. But if a perspective is only made out of distinctions, what does that mean for God? Now here's a mind fuck for you. What if there is no difference between existence and non-existence? Because after all, existence and non-existence is what? It's a distinction. Can you grab that with your mind? Try to grab it. Who arbitrates between the significance between existence and non-existence? So of course we want to say, but Leo, existence is surely different from non-existence. These things are clearly objectively distinct. They're very different things. But be careful here. Who's saying that? From whose perspective? From your perspective? Aren't you biased? Isn't it the case that the reason you find the distinction between existence and non-existence so damn significant is because you think of yourself as existing and you fear non-existence above all other things? So in a sense, you hate non-existence. You're completely opposed to it. Everything in your life you do goes against non-existence so that you may exist. Isn't that true? And isn't it true that that is your perspective? And that could be a relative perspective? So what about God? From God's perspective, is there a significant difference between existence and non-existence? Imagine God's perspective as being the most unbiased, the most objective in quotes here, the most objective perspective possible, like a very honest judge in a courtroom. Interesting. See, one of the mistakes that science makes is that science tends to latently assume that boundaries are objective things. And that's just not the case at all. There is no canonical set of boundaries for all of reality. What science does is science draws relationships and interconnections between different boundaries that it itself draws, and that it itself says are significant and descriptive of reality. And yet, all of these boundaries are relative. Very interesting. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick intermission, because what I've discovered is that when I talk for longer than an hour standing here, it's quite exhausting because I can't move. I have to stand at one spot very still to be right centered on the camera. So I'm going to go grab a drink and take a break. You stay here because we still need to talk about more. And all of this needs to be talked about at the same time because your mind needs to connect all these dots together, and then maybe it'll have some sort of deeper insight. So you stay here and I'll be back in a minute. All right, I'm back. Let's begin our investigation and continue where we left off. So let's think now about the domain of stuff called relationships and hierarchies. This is important. So notice that in our dealings with the world, everything we see around us is composed of relationships, and everything we describe scientifically is also relationship-based. Now, of course, I don't mean relationship as in intimate man-woman relationships here. I am talking about relationship in the most universal sense. So if you have two objects, we can say that they are in relationship with each other. They hold some kind of relationship. Like the relationship of my head to my body is that my body is on top of my head. And the relationship of me to the earth is that I am located on the surface of the earth, and we are both, the earth and my body, exhibiting gravitational force on each other. And in fact, my body, as it's here, we know scientifically, is exhibiting gravitational forces on the planet Pluto, even though the planet Pluto is no longer a planet. And we can even take it so far as to say that every single atom in the universe is exhibiting a gravitational force on every single other atom in the universe, even thousands of light years away. So that is the extent to which we're talking about relationships here. Now, interestingly enough, though, we don't just take all relationships into account. We, in fact, dismiss virtually all relationships that exist, and we only focus on the ones that personally matters to us. So the question we should be concerned about here is who's selecting which relationships are of significance and which ones we should be focused upon. And it's important to notice that which relationships we pull out from reality to work with or to care about or to speak about, that these are just a tiny, less than 1% of all the possible relationships that exist. And that, in fact, if you look at it objectively, all objects are infinitely related with all other objects in our universe and within reality. That's, in a sense, what it means to be a part of reality, is to be in a certain relationship with it and with every other member of the entire system. Now, because we're biased and we have certain values and needs as human beings, we only care about a tiny sliver of all those relationships. And even science, notice, only cares about describing certain types of relationships. And notice that what science is really is the systematic study of the relationships between certain types of variables or phenomena. That's one way to look at science in a very abstract sense. You take two different variables and you say, these must be related somehow, and then you find a relationship through a mathematical formula. But the things you're picking out to find formula for, what are those but a finite number of things out of an infinite number of things which exist? You see? So this kind of puts this whole business of pulling out relationships into perspective. Fundamentally, we have to wonder what makes one relationship more important than another. And if we look at it very objectively, we have to admit that it's nothing other than our own biases. So of course, to me as a human being, and to us as humanity, and to us maybe as scientists, there are certain things we care about more than others. But ultimately, and perhaps from God's perspective, these relationships are all relative. Now, of course, the objection comes up, but Leo, some relationships are clearly more fundamental and more important than other ones. Like gravity, for example, is a very important phenomena, and the relationship that it exhibits on all other objects is very, very important and much more important than other types of stuff. But we have to be very careful about that, because that might just be our bias sneaking in there and skewing our view of what's really going on. Remember that we failed to find a ground for anything. So to say that some relationships are more foundational than others, well, that is a problem because we never found a foundation in the first place. Also remember that we concluded that boundaries are relative and that these are also things that are being drawn. So if boundaries are relative, then which object I see out there is relative to my perspective. And then, of course, if the objects are being defined by me, then the relationships are also being defined by me. There are no relationships out there, really. It's all functioning as one unified symphony, if you want to think about it that way in some poetic language. How can you really say that one thing is more important than another thing when thingness itself is subjective? You're defining which things you call things and which things you don't call things. If everything in our universe is infinitely interconnected, then this opens up an interesting possibility that there might not be such things as hierarchies in the conventional sense. Now, by hierarchies, what I mean is like what a scientist does when they study and create hierarchies. So a scientist will go and study the animal kingdom and then come up with different hierarchies for the mammals and the reptiles and the birds and so forth, and draw all sorts of interconnections and say, well, these came before those and these depend on these, and so it creates a hierarchy. And this is generally what human beings do, is we create all sorts of categories like this, hierarchies, and we nest them in each other and say, well, this one's more basic, this one depends on that one, like that. But that might also be a bias of how we do our science. We tend to do our science in a very reductionistic sort of manner, and we say like, well, we can take an animal like a bird, and then we say, well, that's not really that foundational. Let's break the bird down into cells. Let's break those down into molecules, into atoms. Those are much more foundational. And the physics that put all these things together, that's all foundational. The bird itself is not foundational. That's what we would say. But we have to be very careful about that, because to do that kind of analysis, we have to lose our holistic view of what's going on with reality. Because really, all of reality depends on every other part of reality. And interestingly enough, science often likes to speak of reality as though it's a deterministic system, which means that everything is governed by very strict rules, and that if we were given the initial conditions of our universe, we could just run that and we would get the exact same everything. I would be standing here talking just the way that I am right now if we rebooted the whole universe from scratch, given the exact same initial conditions. Now, there seems to be some debate between scientists about whether reality is deterministic or it's not deterministic. We're not sure. Let's just keep that as an open question. But if we think of reality as a deterministic system, it's actually very interesting, because then what you realize is that there's no fundamental element that's most important, really. You might think that this bird, or take a kangaroo, you might say, well, a kangaroo is a very arbitrary thing. You know, obviously the laws of physics and gravity and so forth, that these are the foundational things of reality. And then a kangaroo, a bird, other creatures, these are all variable. They may or may not come about from gravity. But actually, if everything in our universe is infinitely interconnected, then what that means, in a sense, is that if I gave you a kangaroo and you knew nothing else about our universe, none of the laws, none of the constants, nothing, you, in theory, could reverse engineer our entire universe from that one kangaroo. Because that one kangaroo, in the way that I give it to you, can only exist given everything else in the universe being exactly as it is. So this sort of flips this idea of hierarchies on its head, and it flips this notion of reductionism on its head. From certain perspectives, reality makes sense when we reduce it, but then from other perspectives, it does not. And one thing we have to wonder is, from God's perspective, is it really the case that hierarchies exist? Or are hierarchies perhaps something that the human mind projects upon reality? That's interesting to consider. Perhaps, from God's perspective, everything is equally important. After all, what sense does it really make to say that, well, this part of reality isn't very important? As if you could take a piece of reality and throw it out and still keep everything else the same. See, the human mind, because it likes to simplify reality, because it can't deal with the complexity of reality, likes to think as though we could change circumstances around and make them however we want, and we can just get rid of kangaroos, birds, this, none of that is essential. We like to think about some stuff being essential, some stuff not being essential. But I would submit to you that perhaps from God's perspective, everything is equally essential, including, of course, the stuff you don't like. Maybe even the stuff you hate. And see, this is one of the problems that we have as an egos, as individual human beings, is that, of course, as an ego, we have to survive. And to survive, we have to dislike certain things which threaten our survival. So again, we have a bias here. And as egos, there certainly are things that are very important and essential to us, and other things which we can take or leave. But is that true from God's perspective? Is that true from the perspective of the entire system of reality? I would submit that all of reality needs all the pieces. Nothing is expendable. Nothing is unnecessary. Nothing is unimportant. So let's keep that in mind as we move on to the next domain, which is, let's think about form and formlessness. This ends up being a very important, and it starts to also tie in with distinctions and contrasts. And that original example that I talked about, that infinite object. So consider that all the objects that you've ever known in your life are formed objects. Even formless objects, like you might think, well, electricity is not a formed object, or a cloud, you might say, well, that's not a formed object. No, that's still a totally formed object. What we mean by formed is that it has some kind of shape and form to it, or it's a distinction, as opposed to it being formless, which literally means it has no form. Not that it's amorphous like a cloud, not that it's vague, but that it's actually formless. Form is synonymous with being finite. To have some kind of form, you have to be some kind of way. Like my hand has this form and it is this way. And if it wasn't this form, it was some other form, then it would be that thing and not my hand. So my hand is also in this sense finite. Now the formless, what might the formless look like? Well, the formless might be something infinite. Something whose characteristics are not defined in a particular way. You might think of the formless as the potential versus the actual, whereas the formed is the actual, the formless is the potential. Like, maybe I have the potential to draw a painting, but since I haven't drawn it yet, I haven't committed this intention to a particular painting as a form, it remains as a potential, and therefore it's not actualized. But also it's sort of still there. There's all sorts of possibilities there that are open. Notice that all forms are distinct, and everything that's formless is indistinct. So we've touched on this before. And that turns into a very interesting duality. And notice that even the distinction between the formed and the formless is also a distinction. And it's also, you might say, a kind of form. Very interesting. So keep that in mind. And now let's talk about the final topic, and then we'll tie all this together. And this is the topic of impossibility, power, and weirdness. So the question here is, how can anything be impossible for reality? A lot of times we like to think about reality, but we forget that when we're talking about reality as a whole, which has no limits on it from the outside, that perhaps to it, everything is possible. And this is difficult for us to accept, because when we live in our ordinary world, we know that finite objects have certain possibilities and certain power that is limited. And there's the law of conservation of energy. You can't get something from nothing, right? So if you have some energy in a battery, you can only use so much of it to get stuff done, and then it'll deplete. And you don't have perpetual motions machines. And if someone told you about a perpetual motion machine, you would say that's impossible. But then people make the mistake of carrying that logic over to the whole of reality. And this is a problem, because this means that then when we start talking about some very weird ways in which reality as a whole could work, they say, well, that's impossible. Because they think that there might be things for reality as though it's like a human being. Like, oh, well, certain things for reality are impossible and are difficult. And we'll put the word difficult in quotes here, as though reality doesn't have enough power to be infinite or to be a certain way. But if you think about it, why should it be any more difficult for reality to create one atom versus a trillion atoms? Or to create one human being versus a trillion human beings? Or to create one planet versus 100 billion planets? And if you're willing to buy into that line of reasoning, then maybe it could be true that reality could even be infinite. And that would be no more difficult than for it to be finite. Because after all, how are you judging this difficulty or this limitation in power? Where is this coming from? This is just coming from, if you admit, your own human experience, and you're a limited human being, and the objects around you you see are limited. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case for reality as a whole, because as we've talked about already, the limits of reality, we never found a limit. We never found any kind of reason why there ought to be a limit. And in fact, it makes no sense why a limit could exist, because how would that limit be enforced? And then the other question here is, well, that's just very weird. A lot of these notions I've been talking about seem very counterintuitive. How could reality be so weird? And see, a lot of people get trapped about proper understanding of existence or reality because they don't appreciate that weirdness is also a relative thing. After all, who are we to say and judge what is normal and what is weird? Can you see how this is completely culturally determined? It's determined by your own private experiences. It has no absolute meaning. You say that, well, this is normal, and then, Leo, what you're talking about is weird and it's not normal. But that's a completely subjective judgment. I mean, after all, if you take a human being from 5,000 years ago, and you take that human being and maybe somehow you take a time machine, you warp them into our present time, and you tell him about all the stuff that's going on in the world, and you show him all the technology we have, he would be flabbergasted. Just absolutely floored by all the stuff he sees. All of it would seem very weird. And if you can remember, when you entered this life, all of life felt weird to you. There was nothing normal. Normal is just a sense that you develop based on a past accumulation of memories and consistent phenomena that you've seen. And then that's what defines your set of normal. And what that is, of course, is completely relative. What's normal to you might not be normal to a kid who grew up in Africa, to a kid who grew up in the Amazon, to a kid who grew up on a Martian colony. Normal would be completely different for these people. And normal is completely different for people across time. From 5,000 years ago to 1,000 years ago to 100 years ago to today to what's going to be the case in 10,000 years, normality is going to completely fly out the window. I mean, really think about this. Today, you're sitting at home and you're watching porn on your computer and you're jerking off to that. And you have an LCD screen. This LCD screen is part of a computer which is doing millions of calculations per second just to display your porn. And you're sitting there jerking off to this thing. This thing is being powered by a nuclear power plant, which is getting its power from nuclear fission. And this is happening while you're sitting on top of a ball of Earth, which is spinning around the sun at 30 kilometers a second. The sun itself is spinning around the center of the galaxy at 200 kilometers a second. This whole thing is happening, and you're sitting there jerking off, and you think that that is normal? And now you're saying that, whoa, well, Leo, you're talking about some sort of paranormal ability, or you're going to talk about infinity. That's so weird. Oh, what is weird and what is normal? There's nothing weird about existence at all. Just the very fact that you exist is a very weird thing, if you've ever thought about it. It's extremely weird. Everything is weird. The only question is, how complacent have you become about it? That's really what we mean when we talk about weirdness and normality. So that's a completely relative notion. So now let's take all these different domains and put them all together. Imagine, if you will, that actually there are no who's in reality. There is no ultimate who either. God is not some grand who sitting up in the clouds or outside of all reality. God is actually the absence of who's. What that means is that reality is absolutely groundless. It has no ground, and that's no mistake. That's exactly right, because it couldn't possibly have a ground. And what that means is that reality is an infinite regress of infinite regresses in infinite dimensions with no limit. Reality is absolutely relative in that it is so relative, everything is so relative that it's absolutely so. And the relativism goes full circle from relativism into absolutism. Now, a lot of people don't like this idea of relativism, and they start to dispute it, and they refuse to accept it. But I'm not just talking about some light form of relativism like moral relativism. I'm talking about metaphysical relativism. I'm talking about the very structure of what anything could possibly be. It must be relative. Absolutely so. Because who would there be to arbitrate? Nobody. See, there's nobody to arbitrate anything. All perspectives are just perspectives. And from God's perspective, which is the no perspective perspective, well, that's a very interesting perspective. We need to think about that a little bit more. So reality, what I'm saying here, is sort of like a symmetry of all the possible asymmetries. It's sort of like a hodgepodge of every single possibility that could be, expanding out to infinity, where the whole and all the parts are really one. And to illustrate this so that you really get it, because I want you to really grasp this, I want to give you two very powerful analogies for understanding absolute infinity. The first is the infinite sandbox analogy. And what this is just imagine if we have an infinite block of sand, which is just a gigantic block of sand just stretching out forever, like in the vacuum of empty space. We just have a bunch of sand from the beach. And it's there, and it's like in this giant block. Now, we can make sand castles out of that sand. But this gets way trickier and more interesting than that. Rather than making sand castles using some kind of tools, think of the sand castle as already being a part of that block of sand. Can you use your mind's eye to see that in this infinite block of sand, we have the sand castle, whatever sand castle we can imagine, it's already in that sand. Can you see that? We don't need to carve it out unless we really wanted to. We're just going to use our mind's eye here. We're not going to carve anything out. Can you see that in this block of sand, there are all sorts of potential shapes? There's a circle, there's a sphere, there's an ellipse, there's a star, three-dimensional shapes of all kinds. There's all kinds of sculptures. You could carve a house out of it, a castle, whatever you want. The statue of David, in full size, could be carved out of that sand. And in a sense, it's already in that sand. We don't even need to carve it out. So that's what reality is like. That's what absolute infinity is sort of like, is that all the possible shapes are already there, and they don't even need to be cut out. You see? The statue of David is there. In a sense, we could say that on every beach on this planet, there is a statue of David in the sand already. You don't have to go there and carve it out. It's already there. And not only that, but can you see how many different kinds of sculptures are in this infinite block of sand? Infinite, right? Every possible sculpture that you could carve ever, if you had 1,000,000 billion years, is already there. The only question is, do you want to invest your time to actually carve it out if you really want to make it very obvious? See, our minds tend to be materialistic, and so we want to carve it out in order to consider it real. But consider that from God's point of view, it doesn't really matter whether the sculpture is actual or potential, because again, actual and potential, this is another dichotomy, another distinction that human beings make. To us, it matters if we carve out the statue or not. But from God's point of view, it's already there. See? But now, let's take it one step further. Imagine that rather than just having particles of sand, because after all, sand is sand, it's a very specific type of substance, because reality is not sand. So let's make it closer to what it actually is. Take this sand particle, because it's finite, it has certain shape and properties, and let's make this an infinite object. So this particle of sand, rather than being hard and brown and squarish and all this kind of stuff. Let's make it infinite. By making it infinite, of course, it has to be formless. So it has no form, so you can't imagine it as anything. And in fact, it makes no sense to call it sand anymore, because what we mean by the label sand is a particular type of object with certain properties. But here, we're removing all that. So now imagine this block of sand. I'm still going to call it sand, but now it's called infinite sand. So this block of infinite sand now, out in the vacuum of empty space, and now look into it and see that it contains every single thing that could ever possibly be. And it's already there. And that it doesn't even matter whether it's actualized or not, because actual or potential is really identical. If you were the statue of David in that infinite sand, from your perspective, you would feel like you exist as that statue. But at the same time, the space you're occupying could also be taken up by other statues, you see. All those potential objects and sculptures are all encased in that block of infinite sand. It's all there. And that's what we mean by absolute infinity. Can you see how total that is? It accounts and includes absolutely everything. It even doesn't exist or not exist. It both exists and doesn't exist at the same time. Can you see? Because again, that's another duality that we think in terms of, but in terms of this infinite sand, it even has, every little particle of sand even has the property of existence and non-existence. It has to include those because it's infinite. And of course, it's not a particle anymore. It doesn't have size. It's not small or large. It's not large and it's not small. It's both and neither at the same time. It's everything. You see, it's every possibility superimposed upon itself. And that's what existence or reality ultimately is. From God's point of view, it's just pure potential. From your point of view, it is a particular way because you're like that statue of David in the sand being a particular way. And so it's allowed to be both and neither at the same time. So your point of view doesn't really conflict with God's point of view. Although when you are attached to being a statue of David, well, you're not at that time also allowing yourself to realize that you're the whole thing. It doesn't mean that you've disconnected yourself from the whole thing. You still are the whole thing, but because you've chosen to identify with being a statue of David, well, that's your freedom to do that. And so there you are. And you have created your perspective. And everyone is allowed to create their perspective. But also, at the same time, your perspective is still part of the entire whole. You never separate yourself out from it. You see? You see the elegance and ingeniousness of this? Let me give you the second analogy, which will make it even clearer. Imagine a zip file. A zip file is an interesting thing. A zip file is a file, which is one file, into which we compress a bunch of other files. So let's say I have 100 photos. I want to compress them so it's easier for me to email them to somebody. I'll compress them into a single zip file. Now, the question is, does that zip file, or rather, is that zip file one thing or is it 100 things? It's both. You see, that's its function. That's what makes the zip file useful, is that simultaneously it's both. And the zip file has this interesting property that we can unzip it or then zip it back up. When it's zipped back up, we see it as one. When it's unzipped, all the files come out and we see it as 100. But really, when you look at that zip file, it's always both. It's always one and it's always 100, even when it's compressed or uncompressed. Can you see that? It depends on which perspective, so to speak, you look at it from. Now, because we care about using the files, we have a preference for uncompressing these files. And we say, well, it can be an uncompressed state or in a compressed state. But actually, from a certain perspective, it doesn't really matter which state it's in. The information is all in there. See? And then how you use it is up to you. Depends on what your objectives are. For certain situations, it's good to uncompress. For others, it's good to keep it zipped. That's how reality is. Except what I want you to picture in your mind now is an infinite zip file. A zip file that contains every possible file you could ever create. Ever. Ever, ever, ever. All of them are created inside, and it's all zipped up. And it also zips up in there every single property that could ever be. Every smell, every color, every shape, every form, everything. Existence and non-existence, it's all zipped up together. And you might ask yourself, well, does this file exist? The file zips itself up to such an extent that it both exists and does not exist at the same time. And you might ask, well, where is this file located? On some computer? Like God, does God have a computer that holds this zip file called reality? No. The computer and the zip file are all zipped up together into one. It's all one. And there's no space. There's not even a vacuum for where this zip file is located. You might think, oh, this zip file is just floating out in empty space. No, space is zipped up in the file. A vacuum, the notion of a vacuum is zipped up in the file. It's all in this file. What this file is an infinite collection of every single possible contrast or distinction or finite shape that could ever possibly be, all zipped up together. And now, to really bring this home, I want you to actually look around you right now. Look at your hands. Look at me. Look around you. Look at your dog. Look at your cat. Look your spouse in the eyes. And notice that what you're seeing right now is exactly what I'm describing. I'm not describing something far out there, in the ether. I'm describing exactly what's happening right now. What you're seeing before you is this. It's a collection of finite contrasts which are actually simultaneously infinite. My hand right here is infinite at the same time as it's finite. What I am, what Leo is just an animated statue of David, so to speak, in this zip file, in this block of infinite sand, which is of course animated, and it's talking right now. And here it is doing everything it's doing, and it's just kind of playing out as a movie. But all of this is infinite. Every single piece of it is infinite. It has no ground. This hand, if you zoom into this hand, you can keep zooming into it forever. It will have no end. And if you keep zooming out of the universe, it'll have no end. You can just keep zooming out forever, forever and ever and ever and ever. And the substance of everything is ultimately nothing. Nothing. Nothing is everything. That's the zip file-like nature of reality. Can you see it? Look around you and actually connect what I'm saying to what's going on in your direct experience right now. Try to see the infinity here. The infinity is not somewhere else. It's right here. That's what existence is. Existence and non-existence are right on top of each other. They're not separate things. Infinity, by its very nature, must contain all finities. Can you see? You can't have infinity but not have something else. You might say, well, Leo, how come I'm sitting here right now this particular way and not some other way? Because if you weren't here this particular way, if I wasn't here my particular way, speaking the words that I'm speaking, then absolute infinity would not be absolutely infinite. See? Me, you and everything around us is a consequence of the fact that reality is just everything. It's so everything that it also has to be nothing. Because to truly be everything, it has to go full circle and become nothing. Because if you exclude nothing from everything, you don't have everything. You see? And in a sense, everything cancels everything else out. That's what I meant by it's a symmetry of all asymmetries. I'm a particular asymmetry, you're a particular asymmetry, but it's all balanced out in the end. And it's all just one little fragment of absolute infinity. And this is all not happening in time and in space. It's all happening simultaneously, like one giant nuclear explosion, but even an explosion is not the right word because you think of an explosion happening quickly but still across time. Reality is not a big bang event. Not really. It's just simultaneous everything. It's like God loaded up a shotgun with everything imaginable and then fired it at himself in the face. All at once. And at the same time, it never even happened. You see? Like, it's really hard to come up with analogies for this stuff because all analogies are finite and all analogies take place within space and within time. So you have to kind of jump ahead and see where the analogies are pointing you to. Here's a beautiful poetic way to think about it. Finity is a precipitate of infinity. In the same way that rain is a precipitate of a cloud. Actuality is a precipitate of potentiality. Limit is a precipitate of unlimitedness. Form is a precipitate of formlessness. Reality, as we know it, is a precipitate of God. But even to call these things precipitates is really not quite right, because you get the image of like rain coming out of a rain cloud, and that it actually has to come out. Here, to really precipitate finitude from infinitude, nothing needs to happen. You don't need to actually carve out the statue from the sand. It's just already there. All you sort of need to do is just see it in your mind's eye as such. And of course, your mind's eye is the very object that's there. Your mind's eye is not something sitting behind the scenes. I'm not telling you that this stuff is happening in your brain. Your brain is all part of this. What you call a brain, what you call space, what you call time, what you call reality, all this is just contrast within this cloud of infinite potential. And you might say, well, who is experiencing it? And of course, that's the beauty of it, is that nobody. Nobody is. But you'll say, but I'm experiencing it right now. It feels like I'm experiencing it. Yes, exactly. But in the very place where you feel like it's being experienced and that it actually is, at the very same time, it is not. Here's a brain twister for you. Have you ever wondered that maybe what you consider existence is actually non-existence? So you say right now you exist and everything you see exists, but how would you know that? You're just very familiar with it, so you call that existence. But what if it's actually at the same time non-existence as well? I know it doesn't really make much sense, but then again, ask yourself, how would you know what non-existence looks like or feels like? Maybe non-existence feels exactly the way that you're feeling right now. Maybe existence and non-existence are actually superimposed right on top of each other because there's nowhere else to be and nowhere else to go, because reality, by virtue of the fact that it's one unified thing, there's no place to escape it to. See? You can't go on a holiday to the Bahamas and escape reality. Wherever you go, that's where reality is. Existence and non-existence can't be in different places. But of course, because we're so preoccupied with existence, we only tend to focus, as human beings, on existence. Are you seeing this? This is epic. What I'm telling you is epic when you really get it. What I'm telling you is that reality is a groundless, infinite singularity, and that it contains absolutely everything. Reality is not a physical system. It's not about brains or molecules. All that stuff is just content within reality. All of it is existent and non-existent at the same time. What reality really is, at a substance level, rather than molecules and atoms or particles, is as a system of contrasts. Everything is a contrast to everything else. And what are these contrasts consisting of? Nothing. These contrasts are not made out of molecules. These contrasts are contrasts, and the nature of being a contrast, the very substance of a contrast, is nothing. What this amounts to is reality being a holodeck. The Star Trek holodeck, you know that? It's a holodeck without an actual deck. Just the holo. It's just the stuff in the holodeck, but then when you ask yourself, but where is that coming from? What mechanics are creating it? The answer is absolutely nothing. It's just a hologram. The whole thing is just one giant hallucination. That's what it is. A hallucination is just a collection of phenomena or contrasts without any substance underneath them. And now you're going to say, but how could there be contrasts without any mechanism creating them or any substance to them? That's impossible. That's too weird. But this is where I bring you back to that point about weirdness being relative and impossibility not being a problem for reality as a whole. In fact, this is the most elegant and direct solution. You see, reality is so powerful, it has so few limits, it's so unlimited, in other words, that it's amechanical. It actually does not need a mechanism for it to be. Appearance is the mechanism of what you call reality. Finding other mechanisms, the way science likes to do, is not really going to the core of the substance of reality. That's just exploring more content within reality. It never actually boils down to what the content is made of. It's just content upon content upon content. Because science doesn't want to admit the irreducibly mystical nature of reality. It's amechanicalness. And if you think about it, this is how it must be. It's the only way that you can encapsulate everything into one. Because if you're always positing some other mechanism, you need an explanation for that mechanism, and so on ad infinitum. And that's what we find in physics, is infinite levels of hierarchies up and down from atoms to universes with no end in sight. And yet still nothing is explained. You don't actually explain why the stuff is there. Whereas what I'm telling you explains why it's there, because it both is there and isn't there simultaneously. It is simultaneously everything and nothing. And this explains absolutely everything. There is nothing left unexplained by this. It's total. Total, 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 total. So total that you can't even fathom how freaking total it is. It's so total. And then what's left for science to do is to go out there and explore all the content. Science could spend a billion years researching every little nook and cranny of reality, finding new content within reality, but what the substance of it is, it will never explain because it's what I just told you. And that's exactly how you really should expect it to be, because how can you expect science, which is a limited, finite process within reality, to be able to reach outside of reality to explain it? It makes no sense whatsoever, even in theory, let alone in practice. Do you get it? I really want you to get it. This is the most remarkable thing you could ever possibly get. It's just remarkable. You're alive in it right now. It's happening right now. It's not a theory. It's what's happening right now. Can you see that? To grasp this is to be dumbstruck. To really grasp this is to go weak at your knees and fall to your knees on the floor and to start weeping like a little girl. That's what it means to know this, because you've solved all of existence. You've cognized everything. You know the heart of God. And when you really get there, that's how it feels. It's not an intellectual, oh yeah, I think I understand. It's not like that. It's like, oh, it's an insight that kills you. It's so powerful. It's an insight that melts your heart, that obliterates every single belief and every single notion that you've ever had in your whole life about who you were and what's going on here. It's that profound. I could stand here and talk for an hour and I would not be able to convince you of how profound it really is when you actually have this insight for yourself. That's how total this is. Once you get this insight, your life will never be the same again. Now you might think, oh my God, Leo, now I finally understand. No, the sad part is that you don't understand. What we've done in this episode is we've gone to the limits of what the intellect can do. We've gone to the limits of conceptualization. I've given you a concept. You don't really understand, because if you really understand, I'm telling you, it would literally kill you. And you would be sobbing tears if you really understood the significance of what has been said here. What needs to happen is that you actually need to have a direct experience of this, an experience beyond all experience. You need to actually become God. What I described to you is God's perspective, the non-perspective perspective. It's the absolute aspect of all of relativity. It's to see that everything is relative. Absolutely so. And to actually live as that. It's to stop being you as a human being. Because to be you as a human being is just to be a little statue of David within the larger scope of things. But as you cling to being the little statue of David, you can't be and realize your full, infinite expansiveness. So your job is to find any way you can in life to experience this, whatever that takes for you. Everything that I said here is not the truth. It's just words. It's just finite distinctions and concepts because that's all I could ever do. This is where the road ends, and then you have to go off on your own to see the ultimate truth for yourself, where there are no words. Because words attempt to reach outside of reality, to grasp at reality, but we've seen that that can't work. Because your mind cannot grab on to infinity. Because your mind is finity. How can finity grab onto infinity? And yet, while that's true, simultaneously, finity is infinity. But you need to actually get that and not just hear it from me, or just to think about it, or just to imagine it. Because everything you're imagining is not infinity. It's very finite, and it's very limited. So you can think of everything I said here as not a scientific discourse, not a philosophical airtight argument. This is just poetry. I'm up here doing poetry. And the question for you is whether you can register the poetry and whether it can strike the right chord in you so that you can have the particular kind of experience that poetry is supposed to elicit in you. That's all this really is. I'm not doing science here. I'm not really doing any serious philosophy here. To think that you can grab this with science or with philosophy or with religion or with anything else is to delude yourself. You're taking all your mind stuff way too seriously, and you're failing to register the point that this will never happen through your mind. Is this paradoxical? Hell yeah. The very essence of reality must be a paradox. I hope you can see that. Paradox is not proof of our failure here. Paradox is actually evidence that we've succeeded, because we've had to join every single distinction that ordinary conventional human experience is built upon. We've had to join all those. In particular, we've had to join existence and non-existence together. And that's something that the rational mind can't handle very well, because the rational mind operates upon dichotomies. But then, of course, it doesn't understand that these dichotomies are its own fabrications. And if we want to get underneath all fabrications, we have to destroy all the dichotomies to see, not from our perspective, but from God's perspective. And now you can start to appreciate why science misses absolute infinity and why religion misses absolute infinity. You're not going to get to absolute infinity through a collective effort. You're only going to get there yourself. You're not even going to get there with me. It's not you and me that are going to get there. It's only you who's going to get there. Of course, once you do get there, you'll discover that you were me the whole time, and that the collective was you the whole time, and that was really all just you. I hope that you get to experience this at least one time in your life for yourself, because this is the ultimate experience of life. That's it. Please click the like button for me, post your comments down below, share this with a friend, and make sure that you stay tuned next week for part 2 of this series. Probably next week. Maybe it won't be next week. I'm not quite sure yet, but probably next week, or if not next week, then sometime soon, I'll shoot the part 2, which is going to have a lot of juicy historical interconnections about absolute infinity, and I want you to get those too, because it's some pretty beautiful stuff. So we're going to continue down that road, but the very heavy metaphysical lifting we've all done here today, watch this episode several times and really follow along with some of the arguments that I presented to you. Go through the logic so that you really understand, because after this, you should not have any more philosophical questions. After this, you should start to actually work to have a direct experience of this. All right? Stay with me for more.